Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Michael. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
Good. I'm Sarah Posner. I'm senior editor at Religion Dispatches, and I'm with Michael Brendan Dougherty, who I think since the last time we did this has a new job.
Yeah, I think since last time we saw each other here, I am now politics editor at Business Insider, and I'm in one of these little rooms at the office, and the buzzing office is right behind me, so viewers might get a kick out of seeing people walk by.
All right. Well, I just have books behind me.
We thought we'd begin by talking a little bit about the state of the Republican race, which everyone has been saying has been very well settled with Romney and a series of anti-Romneys for a while. But I actually think it's much more volatile than that right now.
How so?
Well, I think Romney is a uniquely weak frontrunner, and I think he's finally starting to crumble, actually. There was a poll that came out yesterday showing that in Florida, Romney's fallen by almost 30 points, and isn't it?
Right, and Gingrich has something like
Gingrich is the first candidate
in that poll?
Anywhere to capture not only the anti-Romney vote that was held by Michelle Bachmann, Rick Perry, and Herman Cain, but to actually eat into Romney's support itself. And
has that been that? But that was just in Florida. I mean, that hasn't been replicated anywhere else.
And there's unique reasons why in Florida, because for some reason Gingrich is doing gangbusters with voters that are over 60 years old, and
maybe because they want their children to, they want child labor to work for them. I don't know.
And there's going to be a series of articles coming out this weekend, one in Time Magazine, another in the New York Times Magazine, and I think the narrative is going to shift, and maybe I'm shifting it there with a post I just put up this morning, that Romney he's been campaigning flawlessly. He was able to hit Rick Perry from the left and the right. He's had no major stumbles in the debates. He's been pandering to conservatives for 5 years, and he cannot get over 30%. And why is this? And the fundamental reason is he's not likable. And then on the other side, Gingrich has surged up, and I think he is also a very weak candidate. And there's a lot of enthusiasm for him now, but I could see it falling apart, just like it's fallen apart for
every other candidate who's not Romney.
Everyone else. So I think it's still a very wide open race. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Rick Perry got a second look, if John Huntsman got, a lot of talk running up in the next couple of weeks to New Hampshire. I still think Romney...
But I just don't see Huntsman doing well anywhere other than New Hampshire.
Right, well, it's the only place
as far as the early primary states. Right.
But
it's almost as if Romney is experiencing a slow burn, whereas the non-Romney, the un-Romney candidates experience like these rapid rises and catastrophic falls.
Right.
But I think Republicans are running out of alternatives to Romney, and I think that Gingrich as an alternative to Romney, I think also is not. I just can't see him going the distance. There are just so many questions about his ethics and his morals and his honesty and I don't even see him, even with his lip service to issues that are near and dear to the religious right, I just don't see him being the candidate that they look to as embodying those things, embodying those issues, as opposed to just paying lip service to them.
Right.
Now, it's interesting. I think that Perry does embody those issues, and he embodies he's very well liked by the anti-abortion movement in Texas. He's never really, apart from the Gardasil thing, which really has just gone away, he's never really disappointed religious conservatives in Texas.
I think all that's true. I think a lot of the dialogue around Gingrich right now is that conservatives are supposedly salivating at the chance that he'll be debating Barack Obama. And so the more it becomes a focus of who would match up well against Barack Obama, the more
it's clear that that's not
inability
Perry.
to debate
Right.
becomes a problem.
But I just can't, I can't help but think that the debate question, you know, that Gingrich would stack up well against Obama, which I'm not sure is true, but, you know, let's just set that aside for a second. Assuming that's what conservatives think, I think it's more of a chattering class thing that conservatives think. And I can't help but think that there are, just based on my reporting, not necessarily on this specific issue, but just in the past and spending time around religious conservatives in particular, that they're looking for more than a good debater. I mean, they look for somebody that they feel like they can trust. And I think that the trust issue, that's something that, for example, Marvin Olasky, the publisher of World magazine, which is a widely read evangelical, political, cultural magazine, he's really going after Gingrich on the trustworthiness, what he calls the recklessness of Gingrich. So I do think that there's something there in terms of that lack of trust issue that cannot be overridden by good debating skills.
Yeah, I think what's been interesting to me is that Gingrich was left for dead, and now that he's risen really out of the ashes of everyone else's campaign,
right.
The conservative media, and maybe I'm included in this, have just unloaded on him.
Yeah.
Now, they've done it in such a way that they could back away and maybe get behind him in a month or two, but everyone, National Review, Jim Dougherty, the Washington Examiner, Tim Carney, myself, and others have just unloaded on his career as a lobbyist, on his betrayal of the 1994 revolution in '98, on his technocratic inside Washington career, really, and
right.
In a way, someone said that it's really odd that in the search for someone who isn't a technocrat, who isn't an insider, the Tea Party and other conservatives would go to Newt Gingrich. I mean, he's almost the exact profile of the candidate they wouldn't want.
Right, exactly. That's why I find it not necessarily baffling, but it just gives me the sense that this is not going to last. And he's also such a target-rich candidate for Democratic opposition research in a general election that would really play to issues that matter to independents and swing voters. Again, going back to the honesty, the, criticizing Washington, but being the consummate Washington insider and making money on lobbying and then claiming that he's not a lobbyist, he's a historian. I mean, all of these things, I think, he just seems like such a flawed candidate and so easily think of the ads that the DNC could run.
Well, and think of this. I mean, this leads to my other point, which is surprising for me, is look at the ad that Ron Paul created, or the Ron Paul campaign created. It's about a 2-minute and 30-second web video in which they just hang. I mean, they demolish Newt Gingrich with his own words.
Right.
They use all the things, the behavior he condemns, and then just splice it together with newsreels of him doing the exact thing that he condemns.
Right.
And it is brutally effective. And it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it's a model of how to attack Gingrich. And two, it shows a professionalization in the Ron Paul campaign that is suddenly becoming extremely apparent, and it's leading me to believe that Ron Paul will win the Iowa caucuses. He's the most staffed up in Iowa. He's been there every week this year, pretty much. And it just has a very organized operation. He has money, unlike Gingrich. I mean, Gingrich may get money in the next couple weeks, but it's getting late in the cycle to spend it. And the factors that were holding Ron Paul back, which were the rise of Michelle Bachmann, seem to have disappeared.
He did come in second to her at the
just barely win the Iowa caucuses, and I think Mitt Romney will have a very good showing by showing up late. But I think he'll win, and there'll be a tight three-way thing at the top of Paul, Romney, and Gingrich.
Well, I was in Iowa. I covered the Ames straw poll, and he came in second to Bachmann, who had a fairly. I mean, she had a lot of people. She had homeschoolers and others helping her get feet on the ground in Ames. But he also had very enthusiastic straw poll voters coming out for him, and seemed to have a fairly organized operation. Now, it's interesting to me that he had probably, 5-6 months ago, hired Doug Weed as his sort of coalition's outreach person. And Weed is a veteran of Iowa campaigns. He worked for both Bushes, but in particular understood what was happening on the ground when Bush was running against Robertson in '88. And I wonder if that played a role in bolstering support for Paul in Iowa beyond his sort of standard Campaign for Liberty Tea Party contingent.
Right, and you're seeing that there was a standard base for Ron about somewhere between 8 and 14%. And in the polls lately in Iowa, he's been pushing up to like 15, 18, 20, 21%. So something is breaking through. And one thing we've been looking at Business Insider is that a lot of conservative evangelical pastors in Iowa have not been able to unite around a candidate.
Yeah.
And they've gone candidate jumping. I mean, they've gone from Michelle Bachmann. Now a lot of them are looking at Rick Santorum, and Santorum's doing a lot of outreach to them. And, some were at Gingrich, went to Bachmann, now switched back to Gingrich. And so there isn't... And then on the other side, Paul has been allowed into a lot of these forums to talk to pastors or to church members, and he hasn't shot himself in the foot yet with them. So
right. Well, I do know that Weed played a role in that. I mean, he started an outreach group called Evangelicals for Paul, and of course, Weed himself is very well connected with the evangelical community in general. Mm-hmm. And he tried very hard. He actually tried, with David Lane, who's the evangelical organizer who is very much involved in Rick Perry's prayer event in August in Houston, and is generally very involved in these pastors' policy briefings that some of these restoration and renewal groups have at the state level, that Gingrich has also been involved in, incidentally, with his Rediscovering God in America book and tour. But Weed tried to convince Lane of that Paul was a genuine, evangelical that deserved a look. And Lane rebuffed him. But I imagine that this is an effort that has been ongoing since that time, to try to bring in more evangelicals who would sort of traditionally not have looked at Paul, would have had seen him, would have questioned his dedication to some of their American exceptionalism narratives, to some Christian Zionist issues. So there are still issues there, but I wonder if, in the frenzy to find the non-Romney, whether he's getting a look that he might not otherwise have gotten from evangelicals because of the fall of Bachmann, the fall of Perry, the fall of Kane, and now potentially the fall of Gingrich.
There's also been this interesting kind of dynamic. I don't know if my former colleague Jim Antle wrote about it in The Spectator, but there was a little bit of a get clean for Dr. Paul movement among Paul's supporters, which is that there was a camp of Paul supporters that were saying, damn the party to hell if they don't like us. We're going to make a statement and express ourselves and just tell the truth in the most unvarnished way. And if it offends people, they can get over it. But that camp really lost out to the camp that said, you know what, there's a way that we can speak to evangelicals and other Republicans, and we should be trying to build something for the future. And that camp won, and so Paul supporters are going out there and they're learning how to speak, about libertarianism or about the Constitution in a way that appeals to evangelicals just as much as to libertarians. And it's been fascinating.
So what kind of
and
success
also
do you think they're having with that?
Movement for Paul's campaign to actually go negative on Gingrich, I thought was just a revolution in the way that he's done things in the past. And I think it's going to pay dividends for him. I do think, however, that if he does squeak out a win in Iowa, people will say that the Iowa caucuses are a glorified straw poll.
Right,
and
right.
that it's not serious.
But
there's nothing happening here, folks. And, I'm not saying he'll win the nomination, but there's something happening here.
Right. Now, I'm curious about what kind of changes in rhetoric or approach are involved in this sort of quasi-libertarian outreach to evangelicals. I mean, is it a way, how are they reframing some kind of almost required talking points for conservative evangelicals in the GOP primary?
A lot of it is like, the door between libertarianism and evangelical conservatives in Iowa is usually just a relentless focus on the Constitution. One, evangelical Christians still like to recall their fidelity to the Constitution, even as they want to amend it to protect, unborn children, etc. And so the Paulites will argue, well, we may not be for a federal ban on abortion, but we're for allowing states to do as they please. We are for allowing Iowans to govern themselves as they wish. So people make that argument. They also just make the argument that, listen, Dr. Paul has a pro-life voting record. He's voted against funding for Planned Parenthood. He is, he's delivered thousands of children as a doctor. And also, the other big thing is, and you can trust him. Even when you don't disagree with him, even when you don't agree with him, it's very clear where he stands, and so you should respect that at least. Whereas with Gingrich or with some of these other politicians, you don't always know. So,
well, I've also seen him make this constitutional argument in biblical terms. He did that at the Values Voters Summit this year, and I got the sense that he was emphasizing that angle more, not just at Values Voters, but kind of in general. And I wonder if this was part of the same effort that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, he has also...
basically by saying, talking about Romans 13, which is sort of a standard verse that conservative evangelicals cite to say that there's a very limited role for government, and so there's biblical reasons. They make the argument that there's biblical reasons why there's a limited role for government vis-a-vis the individual or the family. And so it's not necessarily a libertarian argument.
Right. Well, and then he's also even gone to the Bible to quote our Lord Jesus Christ when he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," right? So he's even tried to, even with his differences, he's trying to say, like, hey, there are biblical reasons to be with me, even on foreign policy.
To be against the war, right.
And that usually receives an odd reception. There'll be a few that cheer him on, and there'll be a few that start remaining quiet, if you've ever been in a room when he's said that.
Yes, I have. And I think that has a lot to do with Christian Zionism.
Right.
And the ideas of American exceptionalism and America's role in the world that are hard to shake. I think it's for conservative evangelicals. I think that they see Israel's role in the world through a biblical, prophetic biblical lens. They see Christianity as being locked in this civilizational battle with Islam. So I think that kind of language that he uses really deviates from where they're coming from. And I think the other candidates really, not that it wouldn't be a great thing for the country to have a different kind of conversation about this, but all I'm saying is that this is kind of where the majority of conservative evangelicals are on those issues. And that's why when Bachman or Gingrich or Perry talk about it, it resonates more with them than when Paul does his discussion of foreign policy issues.
Right. And also just Paul's, he has, how do you put it? He is officially listed as a Baptist in some ways, but he certainly comes out of like a more Presbyterian understanding of the Bible. But clearly, like his intellect and his imagination is much more influenced by Austrian economics and libertarian polemic from the last 2 centuries than anything else. And I think that has been a sense, that's something that people intuit and sense, but they're okay with it. As long as he's principled and he seems Christian, then they're willing to settle for it. So I think it's going to be fascinating that first week of January to see how it plays out. So
yeah, I wonder, how much of an organization does he have, say, in South Carolina? Because I think that the splitting of the evangelical vote in South Carolina, what all the candidates are looking for is to just get a big enough slice of them and to be the beneficiary of however the evangelical vote splits in South Carolina, because, that's how John McCain won South Carolina. It was just sort of like, you don't have to win a majority, you just have to win enough of them. But I wonder how Paul is going to play there.
Yeah, I think a lot of voters are going to be very fluid in South Carolina and Florida, and they're going to react to what's happening out of Iowa and New Hampshire. So, I think the field really could be narrowed dramatically by the time Florida comes around, and then there's a long gap before the other states get involved. So it actually.
But I can't. Even if as you predict, Paul does well in Iowa, I just can't see him doing well beyond Iowa.
I think he can. I think he can do better in New Hampshire than he did last time, but I think it's going to be difficult. I think because New Hampshire is an odd state. New Hampshire always likes to contradict Iowa. Romney has a big lead there that seems soft, and you've got a Gingrich surge. You've got Huntsman eating into Romney's support. I think New Hampshire is going to be very, very competitive, whereas some candidates have not been investing a lot of time and resources in Iowa. So we'll see. But I think we're going to have a much more fun primary season as far as when the votes are counted than people were expecting. I think people are expecting the anti-Mitt will win Iowa.
But who is the anti-Mitt?
We'll just sort of roll it up from there.
But who is the anti-Mitt? That's the question.
Right now it's Gingrich, but I think that can fall apart within 10 days. Especially with everyone firing at him.
Yeah.
So now it's probably a good transition to kind of get away from electoral politics, which so dominates our minds. Mm-hmm. Why don't you talk about your recent article about what's going on in Texas?
Well, I recently published a piece about the pro-life movement in Texas, and it's a little bit about Rick Perry's role. He's, like I said earlier, he's very much admired by the pro-life movement in Texas. They really see him as an ally who's been hands-on, in their words, helping them with accomplishing their legislative agenda. But also, I think they see him as an ally, like a spiritual ally, who sees the issues the same way they do. They see it as an issue of spiritual warfare with forces that they view as being pro-abortion. What I found there was really interesting. I found evangelical activists and pastors who were really taking a page from Catholics, who really talked about how Catholics had been on the front lines of fighting abortion, and they really admired what they had been doing in terms of having crisis pregnancy centers, sometimes called pregnancy resource centers or pregnancy health centers, which are not clinics, because technically speaking, they're not medical clinics. They don't provide medical care, but they're organizations that provide pregnancy tests for women and then persuade them against, try to persuade them against having an abortion. And these are all very much motivated by religious imperatives. But it was interesting because I found that the Catholics in Texas had been, and maybe this is true elsewhere, had been really taking the lead on this, and the evangelicals admired that. And evangelical churches really see it as their moral duty to get involved in this way. And it's a real shift from, and that's not to say that this other thing still isn't going on, but it's a shift away from, you know, the bloody fetus poster and the yelling about abortion being murder, to this attempt to portray the crisis pregnancy centers as the compassionate option, that women, trying to persuade women that abortion will harm them, not just harm the fetus, but harm them, and that they want to avoid that by carrying the pregnancy to term, and that they would, you know, the crisis pregnancy centers provide booties and blankets and diapers and hand-holding. So it was, but they still use this language, this sort of militant language, in the sense that they see their battle as spiritual war. They see it as a spiritual battle. They see it as them confronting the dark forces at Planned Parenthood. So the piece is up at Religion Dispatches, and it was, I follow abortion politics fairly closely, but I was very fascinated to find this interaction between the Catholics and the evangelicals, and also just how much churches see these crisis pregnancy centers as part of an essential part of their mission now.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I have a theory. I don't have the evidence to back it up, but I wonder if you'd comment on it, which is that as white Protestant churches have become more ideologically sorted, especially in the last 20 or so years, that it opens up the door to this particular kind of activism. So beforehand, you might be in a church with a mixture of people who are pro-life and pro-choice, and so your pro-life activism would look like straightforward political activism, getting out there with signs, taking your model from the civil rights movement or something like that. But as churches become ideologically sorted and more...
You mean more homogenous?
Homogenous, right?
Ideologically, yeah.
That the emphasis becomes on, it goes to institution building, right? And that these crisis pregnancy centers are an institution that you're building over time. It requires sustained amount of money, sustained presence, supplies, and that's something that an institution like a church that's committed to this mission can do, whereas waving the grotesque pictures is something that an activist could do just on one weekend or for a few hours at a time. So I'm wondering if that's at the heart of this. I mean, obviously this is sort of a delayed thing, but...
Yeah, I think that is part of it. I also feel like that there are a lot of churches now that have broadened what they see as their mission field. Mm-hmm. So, it's not just that you have, a soup kitchen, or you just have, a pantry where you have canned goods where needy people can come and get that. They're broadening those sorts of missions to be more ideological, because it's like, the soup kitchen is sort of who's going to be opposed to that, right? And so, but I also feel like and this may be a function of the church becoming more, as you said, sort of sorted or ideologically homogenous. or it's either a symptom or they're related, but the abortion issue is a central part of what they do, but it's not just about, well, you need to go vote for the pro-life candidate, or you need to get out there and go talk to your legislator about this piece of legislation that's pending. It's that you have an obligation to actually do something about this. And it's a way of not only involving your parishioners in something that people who are sort of reluctant about politics will still want to do, but it's also a way of bringing in new believers, right? Because they see these pregnancy resource centers as a way of not just persuading women that they shouldn't have an abortion, but it's a way of persuading them that they should be followers of Christ.
Yeah. And I like the renaissance of crisis pregnancy centers. I mean, I know there's lots of criticism about, do they give misleading information on abortion, et cetera. But I like them. I mean, the church I go to is involved in helping to staff one and encourages us always to volunteer time and money. And I like it because it gets out of the abstraction about this and whether there should be a constitutional amendment or this or that, and it gets right down to someone can come here for help, and here you can help them, and it's a real live person-to-person encounter. I mean, this is obviously why it appeals to churches too, but I don't know, it brings those kind of encounters are what is abstracted away in the political process, but in our day-to-day lives, I feel like they're tremendously important. I like that.
But why do you think that those? I mean, it's sort of interesting to me. Obviously, I'm pro-choice, and the idea that this is the foil for having that kind of encounter, as opposed to some other context in which you could have that kind of encounter. That sort of face-to-face, I want to talk about faith with you encounter.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of cases, I mean, the ones that I've been near, faith is sort of in the background, at least at first. It's something, there might be some posters around the Crisis Pregnancy Center that make it very obvious what the motivation for even running the place is. But usually the first thing is, what can we do? Can we, get you some food, diapers? Can we help you with filling out paperwork to get aid from the government? And that's first. And I like how that de-ideologizes the issue, at least in that moment. But then faith kind of comes in later. Like, the dream of an activist in this is to be like, why are you doing this for me? Although that rarely actually ever happens.
The people I talked to when I was in Texas, I mean, that may be what the first thing they say to a woman who comes into the center. It may be, can I help you fill out paperwork? Can I help you? Can I help you, find diapers or what have you? But they are unmistakably attempting to bring their religion to this woman.
Yeah.
And it's religion that leads them to say, you shouldn't have an abortion. And think about these things, God loves you, and think about these things, these terrible things that will happen to you if you do have an abortion. And it's really using I think it's one thing if you were to just say, oh, you're pregnant and you've decided to keep the baby, let's help you with the diapers and the paperwork and what have you. But I think it's a different thing to say you shouldn't have an abortion because, God tells you these reasons why. And,
yeah.
Now, they're perfectly free to do whatever they want with their private money. But one of the other things that I found in reporting this Texas story is that there's a program in Texas that funds these programs through a TANF block grant to the state.
I mean, what do you...
And that brings in a lot of other issues apart from, the accuracy of information that's given to women or the proselytizing to women that happens at these places, because it brings in questions about, well, what about federal funding or state funding for these things? Does this implicate some constitutional issues too?
Right. Well, I mean, but I agree that those are all other issues. I'm just wondering, though, sort of human to human here, how do you feel about, an evolution that sort of encourages Christians, even if they're religiously motivated, even if they're evangelistically motivated, to encounter women in this way rather than just outside an abortion clinic with a sign and shouting, or I'd have to think that this is comforting in some way, or not, maybe not comforting, maybe it seems insidious, I don't know.
Well, so in the story I write about this mobile crisis pregnancy unit that's parked outside of Planned Parenthood in Houston.
Right.
And it's run by this group called the Houston Coalition for Life. And so it's this bus that's been retrofitted, with a little waiting area and a bathroom and a small counseling room. I mean, tiny, like closet-sized counseling room, and an ultrasound room. And they have activists every day standing outside the Planned Parenthood and going up to women as they're driving their cars into the parking lot and trying to stop them and give them a card and tell them to go across the street to the bus instead. And I just find that's just incredibly intrusive. I mean, is there another situation where you're trying to go to the doctor where somebody would try to stop you from going in there and tell you that there's like a much better non-medical alternative across the street in a bus? Yes, it's true. Like, yes, I find the sort of Operation Rescue approach, horrifying. But this is not... this is troubling. It's deeply troubling because women are just trying to go get health care at a clinic, and somebody is trying to stop them and tell them to go inside this bus instead. And the other thing, and I know you're probably going to disagree with me on this too, but the other thing that happened in this bus was that the nurse that I spoke with there was talking about how they don't provide any information about contraceptives or birth control, which, to me is an essential part of preventing another unplanned pregnancy, if that's what the issue is with the women coming into the bus in the first place. And not only that, but just gave a lot of misinformation about how contraceptives work, or what they claimed are the dangers or the ineffectiveness of contraceptives. And that's very harmful. I mean, if a woman is going to walk away from there believing that that the pill doesn't work, or that other methods of birth control don't work, then she's not going to use them and she's going to end up pregnant again. So that's not, maybe, I don't understand what the goal is there.
Right. Yeah, I'll just bracket any quibbles I have with that. But, I think that's a well-stated case for that side. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting to me. I'll be interested to see where it develops. And, I guess to sum up in a sort of boring way, to transition to, a similar topic. I mean, we're going to constantly have debates about state funding for people that are doing something religious. And there was another issue with this earlier this week, and there were hearings about, whether the federal government should continue to give money to a group that is run by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to help victims of sexual trafficking.
Yeah.
Why don't you explain sort of the little details about that, and we'll get into that.
Well, if I could pull the lens out a little further, and at their most recent meeting, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops announced a new initiative, which they said was intended to protect religious liberty, that they feel like that was necessary. It's a new committee or some kind of task force or something, because they feel like their religious liberty is under attack. Mm-hmm. This is an example. Now, the bishops haven't raised it so much with respect to this particular issue. This has more been raised by Darrell Iss's House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. But there's also another sort of related issue happening right now where the bishops have gone to the Obama administration and said that the new mandate that employers who provide health insurance to their employees must provide copay-free contraceptives to those employees. There's an exemption for churches. The bishops want the Obama administration to broaden that exemption to include other religious institutions like religious hospitals and universities and so on.
Right.
So the ISA hearing is about the Department of Health and Human Services decision not to renew a contract with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to help victims of human trafficking and sex trafficking. Mm-hmm. Most victims who've been human trafficked have also been sexually abused and assaulted. And the reason for the denial was that the agency, HHS, had decided that there should be a preference for grantees who provide referrals to what they call a full range of obstetric and gynecological services, which include contraceptives, abortion, and sterilization.
Yeah.
And because the bishops won't do that, they didn't get their contract renewed. And ISA was having this hearing attempting to claim that this demonstrates that the Obama administration has an anti-Catholic bias and there's this religious liberty issue and so on and so forth. There was a very overheated discussion in light of the fact that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and Catholic Charities and other related Catholic organizations get tens of millions of dollars in federal grants every year. It was just this $2 million grant that was denied for that very specific reason.
Right.
So there's not this big overarching anti-Catholic bias in the Obama administration. It was just a political show trial of a hearing that some of the Democrats who were Catholic really spoke out against it. Jerry Connolly, a Democrat of Virginia, talked about it being a modern day inquisition against the secular state. So it was quite heated.
Yeah, I mean, there's what I think is going on here. I think you actually gave a great summary of it. Although I think we could go even deeper, which is that there's a lot of pent up emotion about some of these issues and some of the people involved. Kathleen Sebelius was asked by her bishop in Kansas City to not receive communion because of her support for abortion rights. And there's sort of been in the Catholic press, the conservative Catholic press, there's been definitely like an anti-Sebelius,
right.
Information glut over the past decade, really.
Yeah.
And what's also interesting, and this hasn't been reported on as much, and I wish I looked into it even more, was some of my fellow hardcore traditional Catholics actually fought the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and their charity organizations for working with other social organizations that do refer women to abortions or to contraceptive services. And when I talked with a representative at the UCCB, or USCCB, she said that they cannot, they subcontract a lot of their work out sometimes.
Right.
And that they don't, they can't enforce their rules on all the subcontractors, even if they have a preference. So in some ways, I mean...
So there are some Catholics who are even, saying that the Catholic charities or the Catholic bishops aren't going far enough in ensuring that their subcontractors aren't doing these referrals.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So, I find it interesting. There's also just...
So how attenuated does it have to be to cause an issue? You know what I'm saying? It's like there's you are not making the referral. How much in the minds of these traditional Catholics do they have to go to make sure that a subcontractor isn't possibly referring a rape victim to a gynecologist who might provide something? I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's like, how far out does it have to go to satisfy someone who has this concern? Because it just sort of seems like at some point you have to just be satisfied that, the bishops themselves aren't doing it if that's what your concern is.
Right. I guess, I mean, it's tough. I mean, it's the same issue of that's causing the dust up over contraceptives, right? So it's not actually like say Belmont Abbey University, which is in the other issue we're talking about, where do
the insurance
religious
coverage for the contraception
institutions, if the Obama administration has a regulation that all health insurance companies must provide non-co-paid contraceptives to women in all their health insurance plans, is the Belmont Abbey University morally culpable then for buying health insurance for its employees that includes that coverage? I think that's a tricky question. I think, so Belmont Abbey University is trying to say we should have a right to buy a healthcare plan that doesn't include this. People work at our university freely. We don't force, it's not like compulsory to work here. And we want to be able, if it's available, to buy health care that complies with our moral standards. Personally, I think that's perfectly reasonable. And that people who want that coverage could go work for somewhere that, doesn't require a copay in their health plan.
Well, it's interesting. NPR had a story this morning on this issue, on this insurance coverage for the contraception issue. And they were pointing out that, and this has not been pointed out very much, but it's true, that a lot of Catholic colleges and universities, and I think even hospitals, already provide insurance that covers contraception. It's just that there's now this mandate that you provide it for free, that the insurance covers it for free with no copay.
Right. And
now they're objecting to. So it's sort of like, okay, well now you're objecting to this? Well, Georgetown University provides insurance for its employees that includes coverage for contraception, and that hasn't been an issue, but now all of a sudden it is an issue. And so that's sort of, I mean, do you have any idea why all of us now with the mandate that it's become this big religious liberty issue, when for years all these Catholic institutions have been providing this insurance coverage anyway? Well,
there's a lot going on here, right? So I think it's coming up now because there's more anxiety now. I think it's always been bubbling under the surface, and a lot of Catholic, a Catholic like me would look at a place like Georgetown or Fordham and say that, well, these institutions do a lot of things that violate, what I think the Catholic faith is or does. I mean, Fordham University holds conferences on expanding civil rights for gays and lesbians across the country at their law school. That's clearly against the spirit and tone of church documents like Ex Corde Ecclesia and all these other documents that try to keep these institutions in line with church teaching. So it's not a surprise, although I think a lot of people just don't know that this is how it works. And then on the other side, as far as health insurance is concerned, people are also dealing with a limited market. So there may not be in a lot of states health insurers who can offer a special plan to Catholic institutions that doesn't include coverage of contraceptives. So the question is then, should the church just absolve itself and say, well, this is what's available on the market, this is the best we can do? Or should the church be more aggressive in trying to create an alternative?
The reality is that very few Catholics follow that teaching themselves. So, right. It's sort of a question of like, well, is this so, I mean, how much are you going to require Catholics and non-Catholics, the non-Catholics that you employ, the Catholics that you employ that disregard the prohibition on using artificial birth control, right? Mm-hmm. And then the non-Catholics who don't
even believe,
don't have any, don't share your religious belief. How much do you feel like it's important for a Catholic institution to try to enforce that on people who don't care about it anyway? I mean, it's not enforcing it on them in the sense that like they could still get it. It's just that their insurance won't pay for it,
right? Or their insurance won't pay the copay for it.
Right?
I think it's important to try to avoid these things when you can. I mean, personally, if you're asking me as a Catholic, I think it's important to try to avoid them. I think
Try to avoid.
Well, to avoid participating in any way in,
I see.
Like church institutions avoid participating in things that they, tell people are sinful. Whether through an indirect subsidy like this, right? So the church isn't quite intending to fund contraception. They're intending to buy health insurance, and the only options, because of the law of the land or because of the supply in the market, are insurance companies that cover this. So if you can avoid it, I think you should. I do think these questions are going to come up with an increased frequency and intensity in the coming decades. I mean, so that's a mandate on what health insurers provide. What about a mandate that says that you have to cover the same-sex spouse of an employee, and suddenly, our Catholic universities and hospitals or Catholic parishes that find out, they're employing someone who has a same-sex partner going to be facing civil rights lawsuits if they do not provide health care coverage for their spouse, or if they try to fire someone who has a same-sex partner spouse to avoid that question altogether. I think it's fair to say that a lot of people think that health insurers should be required, and employers should be required to offer the same health insurance to gay couples as to heterosexual couples. I mean, I don't think that's controversial to say that that's what people are looking to build towards. So, I think that this is like a preview of what's going to be coming down the line.
Right. And I think that that's why the bishops created this Religious Liberty Committee, or whatever they're calling it, because they see that, and that these are issues that they're going to continue to press. But the question is, and I think you and I tried to get at this on Twitter, but I didn't have time or the ability to condense it into 140 characters. But this is a question of, so what exactly should the religious exemption be when civil society has reached some sort of consensus about these sorts of issues, right? And when there's scientific evidence of the utility and health benefits of something like contraception. So, here you have 97% of American women using contraception at some point in their life, right? Mm-hmm. And, nobody's stopping Catholics from practicing natural family planning. I mean, nobody's saying you can't do that. And so I don't, it's hard. I think that we're looking at a possibility of changing what the rules are on when your religious conscience needs to be protected. So I think that is more of the conversation that perhaps needs to be had. Like, where are those lines of protecting religious conscience? Because I think that there are other contexts for religions that perhaps do not have the political clout that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops have, that, may feel that there are numerous mandates or statutes that violate their religious conscience, but don't really have the political pull to really raise objections to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, my personal feeling is that, or my personal prediction is that this is going to get very bad and ugly for the church within a few decades. I mean, I fully believe that Catholic churches will lose their tax-exempt status at some point and be punished.
Really? Why?
And punished for their views that at odds.
But the IRS never revokes anybody's tax-exempt status, particularly churches. Why would they Why would they revoke the Catholic Church's tax-exempt status?
Well, I think we're along. There are many steps between now and getting there, but I would say that I believe that Catholic churches, because of their views on homosexuality, will be viewed as something akin to something like the Ku Klux Klan in a few decades if they hold firm on this. So
well, I think
whatever
that there's a
legal
difference
penalties can be brought to bear, I think will be.
I don't think the IRS can revoke somebody's tax exempt status because of their views, right?
Right, but in a few years, if the Catholic Church is committing a kind of civil disobedience by, say, not employing people with same-sex partners, or a lot can happen. I'm sorry I brought this up because I kind of jumped way out and ahead and maybe probably sound a bit conspiratorial.
Well, maybe it's time for your monologue then.
But, well, how to draw the lines.
Yeah.
I don't think there is a good way to draw the lines. My view is that in democracies, like if you read Tocqueville, they don't abide differences very well. They want hard and fast and legible rules that apply equally and always to everyone. So that's why a debate about, what a health insurers have to cover becomes so heated, because democracies don't tolerate differences, and they don't tolerate for long fundamental differences in conceptions of the good or the beautiful or the just. I mean, you have to kind of decide as a nation what is just or good.
I don't think that this is an instance of people not tolerating a difference, because I think that nobody is trying to sanction the Catholic Church for its beliefs on contraception. No one is trying to take anything away from the Catholic Church. There's no punishment involved for the Catholic Church for its beliefs. This mandate is just a recognition of the medical value of contraception for women, and as in this NPR story that I talked about earlier, that it's a question of gender equity under the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, and a recognition that the vast majority of American women, including Catholic women, use birth control. So I have a hard time seeing that this is like some great infringement on the religious liberty of Catholics, because Catholics are still free to practice that belief and live it out in their own lives.
But Catholic institutions, under these rules, would not be free to not choose a health plan that doesn't financially subsidize these, and you'd be enshrining in law a view of contraception. You're saying that it has medical value. Well, Catholics who disagree with contraception would say, no, it doesn't. That what you're doing is you're using medical as a kind of euphemism for something else, and that's what I mean.
What is it
a
a
moral
euphemism
choice.
for?
I mean, I know Catholics who don't use contraception, and they're not sick and dying in the streets. I mean,
okay,
right? I mean, it's not like medically necessary, like, I don't know, nutrition is.
Well,
so
in some, first, I view it as a medical necessity to prevent an unintended pregnancy. I know that you see it differently, right?
Right, of course.
But the issue is not. The government cannot protect the religious beliefs of everybody. At some point, there's a consensus, and people have to live with the government that they fund with their tax dollars doing things that they disagree with or find morally objectionable. War is a good example of that. The death penalty. There are a lot of things that I find morally objectionable, that a lot of people of varying religious beliefs find contrary to their religious beliefs. But at some point there has to be this is just what we consent to in a democratic society, as long as this is not infringing on my ability to live out my religious beliefs in my own life. Now, you are saying that it is infringement on Catholics to require Catholic institutions to provide this insurance coverage, even for employees who aren't Catholic themselves,
Yeah, with their own,
or are
their
Catholics,
own money, right? So, like, I could
or
make
are
a
Catholics
distinction
that are not.
I can make a distinction between a war I disagree with, where the government has taken my tax money, and then the government is deciding what to do with it. Whereas another regulation like this particular one would be the government telling me what I have to purchase with the money that I have, right? There's not an exact analogy, right? I was trying to think of one the other night. Many Jews eat pork, but you wouldn't require a Jewish school to serve pork in its cafeteria because pork has some health benefits, that fats are good for, nutrition, etc. It's not an exact analogy, but there are plenty of Jews who eat pork. You could still avoid eating pork at a Jewish school if you wanted to follow that. But I mean, if someone suggested that we should do that because there are health benefits to eating pork, that would be, I think, an insane suggestion.
Well, I think that what
underlies this obviously is that debate where we can't agree, which is that is contraception medically necessary, and can society come to such a firm consensus that it is willing to impose on Catholics the duty to subsidize it. At least that's how I would frame it.
But they already do. I mean, what this story in NPR was pointing out was that they already do.
Right. I agree that they already do.
Right. So why now?
Well, I would say that they're wrong for doing it now if they can avoid it.
So you think that the Presbyterian employee of Georgetown University should just have to abide by the Catholic teaching on this and not have the copay-free contraception?
Yeah, I would prefer if Catholic institutions had an identifiable Catholic identity. I don't. Unfortunately, they don't. I think in a lot of cases they're in this compromised position, and most of it by choice. They're.
Well, if Georgetown, I hate to, I'm just picking at Georgetown randomly. This is not something about Georgetown, but they want to have a diverse student body. They don't. I'm assuming that they want students of different religions and backgrounds and faiths attending Georgetown. They want professors of different backgrounds. They want, so. Once you want that, once that's what you've decided that you're going to do, even though it's ostensibly a Catholic institution, then I think that changes the equation a little bit.
Right. Well, so then the question is, who's imposing what on whom, right? So is the question that, the government is saying to an institution like Georgetown, if it wanted to buy a healthcare plan that didn't subsidize birth control, it's saying, no, you can't do that. Or does Georgetown tell its employees, we're not providing this benefit, so this is something you'd have to obtain with salary that you've earned on your own steam?
But the Catholic institution has paid that salary.
Right, yeah, no, they have, right?
So, okay, so are you going to take it that far that you can't, because if the Catholic institution paid your salary that you used to buy your birth control pills...
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they're culpable in the same way that I'm not culpable for a war paid out of my taxes, right? If I've cast my vote, for an anti-war candidate or voiced my opinion, that is directly what I can do. Now, a professor earns their money through their work. They've done their work. They've received a just payment. Now they're free and responsible to do what they wish with that money. But should the church or its institutions be obligated to or be implicated in the purchase of things that by their nature are used for things that the church is against? I think there's a distinction that can be made there that's somewhat coherent. I don't know if there's a regulatory system that works across 300 million people that makes it coherent.
Well, then there's the question of, would we be having this discussion if it was an Islamic group that said, we're opposed to this, and so we can't provide health insurance that provides we don't want to, we want an exemption from this. Would we be having the same conversation?
I think there would be talk about that. But, if the Catholic Church is powerless to stop this kind of thing, then I think, especially since the Catholic Church has built up at least some credibility and history within the nation, then I think Muslims would have an even more difficult time.
Well, what I'm saying is, would it even be taken seriously by conservatives?
I think it would be taken seriously at places like, the Cato Institute, or, something that's really committed in an ideological way to free markets, less regulation, etc. They would bring it up. In the same way that it's going to be interesting, because we've had issues where we've had debates about religious minorities like Christian Scientists or the Amish or Mormons, who very clearly at different points in history have lived at odds with the moral consensus of Americans writ large. And so on what level can we interfere? And sometimes you get even smaller groups, like people that practice Santeria or whatever. And there's never been, I think, a principled jurisprudence established to handle that kind of diversity.
Well, my understanding of the jurisprudence is that in order to have some sort of conscience exemption, the law or mandate in question has to infringe on your ability to engage in your religious rituals or practices.
Right. So, I mean, does that mean...
that's why, there was some Supreme Court case involving the smoking of peyote, and I can't remember the religious group involved, but they were allowed to have it because it was an essential part of their religious ritual.
Right.
So I think that the USCCB's objection to take the insurance mandate again is more attenuated than that.
Right. I mean, it's definitely, if we're coming to a point where the only conscious exemption that religious people get is that when you're in your church, you can have bread and wine, and we can't criminalize that. But otherwise, we could compel you to pay for your neighbor's abortion, or an abortion in the Philippines or somewhere else, But that doesn't happen. They already have that exemption. Right.
I mean, federal money does not go to pay for abortions, and there's, so...
Right, but you would...
We have the Hyde Amendment.
But you would like to see that change, right?
Oh, yes.
Right. So, there's that. But, but you're saying that theoretically, the Catholic Church or a Catholic university or a Catholic hospital could be required, a Catholic hospital could be required to perform abortions, to offer abortion services, or not.
I don't think so. I do think that the conscience laws do protect them against that.
Okay.
I think that there's a conscience law in place. What I'm saying is that there are conscience laws or regulations that get implemented due to political considerations. Right. And then there's the Supreme Court jurisprudence, which is a different question. I think that the reason why the bishops are attempting, I don't know, maybe they are contemplating a lawsuit if the contraceptive, copay-free contraceptive mandate goes into effect as written, that I have no idea. Maybe they will challenge it legally. But what they're trying now is political pressure as opposed to a legal challenge.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I know that the president of Belmont Abbey College has said he will shutter the college
rather than
comply with this, which is pretty dramatic. But we'll see. I think this is going to be a long-running thing.
And so I'm sure we'll talk about it again too. But you had something that you wanted to talk about.
Oh yeah, just unveil. Briefly, just a note on the direction of the Catholic Church for the coming next 20, 30, or 40 years. Mm-hmm. There's been a definite change in the type of man that is appointed bishop under Pope Benedict and under John Paul II. John Paul II was showed a lot of preference to bishops who were social creatures, who, were good with cameras, were good politicers within the church, good politicers outside of the church. And that is not the model of man that's getting appointed bishop now. Ratzinger has a supreme preference for intellectuals.
Text readers as opposed to people readers?
The what?
Text readers as opposed to people readers.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting. I think there's the genesis in this goes back, almost 60 years, in that Ratzinger and others who were liberals at the Second Vatican Council believed that the Roman Curia and the Vatican were too unresponsive to what priests and bishops had been saying in the first half of the last century. And they were saying that, this kind of rigid manual textbook theology isn't reaching people anymore. And yes, the pews are filled, but spiritually there's no depth in the church. And so at the Second Vatican Council, they kind of broke a little bit the authority of the Pope by emphasizing collegiality in individual bishops. And in other words, trying to give them flexibility. And that very flexibility that enables Georgetown or Fordham to kind of stray a bit from kind of strict observance of teaching. The results of that have not been a renaissance in the Catholic Church by any means of that style of governance or that style of bishop. And it seems like Ratzinger, who obviously has some regrets about how things turned out after the Second Vatican Council, believes that the way to remedy this is to put in tough-minded theologians throughout the church who... You're troubled by this. I'm a little... I don't know if I'm troubled. I just think it's very interesting. And actually, the head of the office that helps to appoint bishops said something very interesting today, which is that a lot more people turned down the chance to become a bishop than he would have imagined. I like the idea of the church regaining its mind and its intellect, but governing a diocese, governing parishes is very different, a very different task than studying historical theology and the Bible itself. So I feel like this is a grand experiment, and I'm not sure where it leads, but it is. I think it's going to change the way the church is perceived for a generation to come. I think you're going to see a lot more criticism of the bishops and the church in the future as being overly intellectual and out of touch.
Criticism by Catholics or by non-Catholics?
Both. That the church is sort of in an ivory tower.
Well, could you make the argument that the arguments that they're trying to make now present them as out of touch? This contraception mandate that we've been talking about. I mean, because I think that the bishops are perceived by a lot of people as being out of touch, based on that alone. And you're saying that this over-intellectualization of who gets appointed bishop is going to put them more out of touch. I mean, it sort of seems to me that looking at it as an outsider, a non-Catholic, and seeing how they're being perceived by non-Catholics and even Catholics who disagree with them on reproductive health issues, that you're pointing out an even further marginalization of who the Catholic bishops represent.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're entering maybe in an age of polarization where the church will continue to get smaller and more faithful to that stricter vision. And I think Cardinal Ratzinger's emphasized that in his career before he was Pope, and now he's almost creating that vision through his appointments. On the one hand, I think those appointments will be good in that they'll be articulate expounders of the truths of the Catholic faith, but I don't think they're going to be charismatic in the way that John Paul II was, where you sort of see this lived demonstration, and some of the difficult parts of the faith, or the parts that seem out of touch, are sort of bracketed or shoved off away. I mean, if you go into most Catholic parishes today, you're not going to hear about contraception at all. I mean, the priests actually know that no one wants to hear this. I think in 20 years, that will not be the case. I think you'll hear about it.
Really?
And the beginning of that is with appointing these types of men bishops.
And so they'll talk about it as issue injunctions against it.
Yeah. Yeah. That they'll just...
Well, that's sure to bring a lot of new converts.
Well, not only that, but I think it just is a natural human institutional thing, which is that people will say, oh, people who talk this way advance in the church. This is what we're doing. This is how it goes now. I'm going to fall in line. Obviously there'll be outliers, but I think the great arc of the church has shifted direction at an institutional level, and it's going to get interesting.
Well,
yeah.
I have a feeling we'll be talking about all this stuff again.
Yes. Well, and if I don't talk to you, have a happy New Year.
Thank you.
Between now and then.
Well, it's a little early for that, but
it is. But happy Hanukkah or holidays, whatever's coming your way
and
at the
all
end
of
of this
that.
one.
Yes. All right.
All right.
Well, in the meantime, have a good weekend.
All right. You too.
Thanks, Michael.
Bye-bye.